Hello, American Prestige viewers, I guess, since this is going to be on YouTube. It's Derek here, obviously, and I am very grateful to be joined by Stephen Semler. Stephen is a senior fellow at the Center for International Policy. He's the co founder of the Security Policy Reform Institute. He's a contributor to the Costs of War Project. He's recently written, he's also the purveyor of a Substack newsletter called Polygraph that we'll have a link to in the notes. And we will also link to a piece he wrote for Popular Information a few days ago, last week, called "The Real Cost of the Iran War: $72 billion for the first 60 days." So, Stephen, thanks so much for coming on the show.
My pleasure, Derek.
Let's run through the first before we get into to your piece. Let's run through the waves of bullshit that have been coming out of the Trump administration about how much this war is costing. It was uh, 25 billion for the first 2 months was the line that Pete Hegseth has been spinning to Congress. Coincidentally or not, he's up there with Dan Kane this week, pushing for their $1.5 trillion Pentagon budget. So they've been going with 25 billion for the first 60 days, which is already pretty high. I mean, we're talking about, I think, Afghanistan war surge levels of spending at that figure. The latest thing I saw was in the 2 weeks roughly since 25 billion was being bandied around. It's now closer to 29 billion is the figure that they're passing around. But how many iterations of this have we gone through of the Pentagon basically drastically undercounting what is actually being spent here?
When they gave that $25 billion figure a few weeks ago, that was the first time that Pentagon leadership has publicly come out and given a figure at all. And when they gave that figure, I think it was in front of the House Armed Services Committee this morning, they're in front of House Appropriations. I think when they gave that figure, I don't think anyone in the room believed them. And then when pressed, they were constantly asked by members of Congress to reaffirm how much it was. It's like, are you sure it's 25 billion? Would you like to revisit that number? And they said no. They said no. They stuck with it. Uh, and when asked for a specific breakdown, basically just a rough outline or just a summary table of how they arrived at that cost, they weren't able to provide one. They said, well, we'll get it to you. And then this morning, so that was a couple of weeks ago in front of the House Armed Services Committee. This morning or today in front of the House Appropriations Committee, so appearing before two of the most important committees when it comes to the Pentagon budget. And they were asked again, and they said it was 29 billion this time. Still no summary, still no cost breakdown. And then I have one exchange highlighted here that I'd just like to read quickly. Rep. Aguilar asks Pete Hegseth, uh, when can you share more formal accounting on the cost of war with Congress and with this committee? Hegseth, we'll share what we can. I think we've updated on that number this morning, but when it's relevant and required, we will share it. This is front of the
When would
House.
that be? Do
And
you think?
yeah, and then Aguilar,
It's not while you're testifying before the House Armed Services Committee. That's not relevant then.
yeah, I mean, this is the committee that funds their budget, and they still don't have a figure put together. So I think, over the course of these last 2 weeks, they're making the number up as they go along. And it's no coincidence that a day after Hegseth and acting Comptroller Jules Hurst testified in front of Congress, unnamed Pentagon officials leaked to CBS and I think also to CNN um, that the real cost was closer to 50 billion. So twice what it was. And then that was the genesis of my piece, because I was less bothered about Hegseth lying to Congress than that new $50 billion number, because I didn't want that to become sudden. It's like CBS was marketing as the true cost or the real cost, and that was still too low due to some quirks or defects in Pentagon accounting.
Given CBS's editorial direction these days, I'm surprised they even went with the 50 billion figure.
Me too.
Um, but I mean, I don't want to get like too far off topic here, but I don't know which is worse, whether they went to the meeting with the Armed Services Committee, throwing around this top line number, and never thought that there was a possibility they would be asked to document it or account for it, or if they it's just a stupidity thing, or if they went in thinking these guys are going to be so grateful to us for giving them a number that sounds relatively manageable. Like $25 billion, a lot of money, but in the big scheme of things, it's not something. It maybe won't set off as many alarm bells as the true cost. And they thought that the congressman would be so grateful that they wouldn't want to ask any questions, because then they'd have to confront reality, but they'd be happy to be lied to. Like, I don't know which scenario there I find less comforting, I guess.
Yeah, me neither. I think, I mean, the bottom line is that they lied to Congress, and they're lying to
Right.
Congress again, based on that figure that the Pentagon pushed out, just, through unnamed sources. I think one of the things that I'm really struck by is just the lack of effort when it comes to, from the Trump administration, when it comes to lying about the cost of the war. I mean, they're just throwing out this 25 billion or 29 billion, providing no justification or arithmetic. Like, you can bend your methodology to kind of suit your ends. I don't think anyone would believe it if it was transparent, which is why they don't do it. But there's just a complete lack of effort in terms of lying to
Yeah.
of like the amount of effort that's going into lying to Congress. And
I mean,
this
we've
is,
we've talked about that in terms of the run up to the war. Like, there was no effort put into making a case. There was just like, we're going to war with Iran. Catch us later. And then they act surprised that people ask, like, why are you going to war with Iran? Like, it's didn't occur to them that somebody might come back and say, do we have a reason for this, or are we just winging it? Like, what's going on? And yeah, it's been a total lack of effort compared to like the W. Bush administration. Total lack of effort here across the board.
yeah, Bush primed the press. He squared the UN. He made up his reasons. With this, it's kind of, to me, it reflects an administration and an institution, the Pentagon, that believes wholeheartedly and for good reason that it will just not be held to account by Congress or the public. And they're making a great amount of effort to sell to the public that this war is, for the lack of a better word, cool, very fascinating, interesting,
Yeah,
useful. But there's too much information and there's too much real experience that the public has access to know that that's bullshit, and that this is just really, really hideous war on every single level, from a material standpoint to a moral standpoint. And I think cost is one of the reasons, is one of the key links that this war is linked to everyday people, at least in the United States. It's linked to the taxpayer. It's an intimate relationship there, because the public funds, public funds, and public funds are being used to fund this war. So
right.
the administration is going out of its way to sell this war and advertise it, but also hide the grisly parts and the
Yeah,
stuff it doesn't want talked about.
yeah. I mean, the only mark that this is working on, like this war is cool, seems to be Donald Trump himself, who gets was getting his daily briefings of 2 minutes of buildings blowing up, and seemed to be happy with how things were going.
Right.
All other evidence to the contrary. So yeah, he's the only one who seems to be the audience, or the working audience for this stuff. But let's get into the piece, because your estimate is $72 billion for the first 2 months of the war. Talk about how you came to that figure, and I want to delve more into the accounting tricks, but just kind of give people an overview of how you came to this estimate.
Right. So this is direct war costs only. I'm not looking at the broader economic costs. I'm not looking at the longer term budgetary costs like veterans care. This is just the amount that the US has put up so far, the amount of resources that the US has committed to this conflict, conservatively, of course. Um, and I did it this way, one, because frankly, the economic cost evaluation is a little bit beyond my skill set. I only know like one or two people who can do it well. Linda Bilmez is probably the best person to do it. She probably has a cost estimate coming out, at least from what I can gather. But this is just a measure of direct war costs. And this is the number that Pete Hegseth and unnamed officials said in front of Congress, then leaked to the press. My number is just a rebuttal of that. It's the same exact parameters. It's just my number is more accurate. And it's broken down into four categories. One is operations, the cost to basically operate to conduct war operations. It's the cost of deployment. It's the cost of an operational tempo that exceeds peacetime by a lot. The costs are higher. Um, War makes everything more expensive, including war, particularly the logistics tail of it. And it's ironic in some ways that this war has jacked up fuel prices, and then fuel prices are such a huge part of military expenses. So the war they're fighting has made war itself more expensive. So operations is one, uh, weapons is another. This is the biggest category, over half of the total at about 40 billion, a little bit over. And this is just the burn rate of munitions that you hear reported, the interceptors especially, that have been such a huge expense. Then there's losses, which we don't have a full picture of because a lot of the losses to military bases and other assets to the region are based off of satellite imagery.
Right.
And
Another thing the Pentagon's been lying about for the
yes,
last 2.5 months.
exactly. And then so the Pentagon has, I don't know, some scandalously worked out a deal with several satellite imagery companies like Planet Labs, for instance, where they delay or obfuscate entirely satellite imagery of US bases. So basically the damage to US bases is pretty much on a 2 week tape delay. Um so
Just to put a point on that, like the Washington Post did an analysis of this. They had to go with Iranian satellite imagery
right.
because the Iranians have been releasing their own satellite stuff, which is not as refined or as sophisticated as what the U.S. or the Planet Labs and those companies could be doing. But that's the only place that any information is coming from. And they geolocated. They did a lot of work to make sure that these images were really showing what they were showing. But it's clear that there's extensive damage that is not really being it can't be assessed yet because the Pentagon's covering it up basically.
Exactly. And you notice every single time there's a revelation in that regard in terms of damage to US military bases using revealed by satellite imagery, it's always far more than, somewhere in the article it says far more than previously disclosed or far more than administration officials will admit. Uh, Again, this is just an administration very, they see value in performing the war itself, and if the performance is compromised in any way or infected by real world considerations like fuel prices or cost of living or the budgetary cost or damage to US military infrastructure and assets, then it looks bad. Additionally, it's not just US military bases, the infrastructure, but also lost F-15s, lost KC-135s with, for the KC, we can touch on this later, but the KC-135 is being replaced by the KC-46A, which is just a far more expensive variant. So that's one thing that I think um, led to the undercount on the part of the unnamed Pentagon officials. And then lastly, the last of the four, so we have operations, weapons, losses, and then the last one is a category I labeled subsidies, which is paying for Israel's war costs. Um, for this one, I estimated by having the pot of funds, the over 4 billion in U.S. military aid provided to Israel per year, and then just roughly estimated based on the amount of notified sales to Congress and the amount of what's called under threshold sales, which is sales that aren't valuable enough to trigger a congressional notification. This is a very sneaky way you can bypass public scrutiny for sales, perfected by the Biden administration and then
Yes.
adopted by the Trump administration.
Yes.
So all told, 71.8 billion or rounded 72 billion.
So I want to talk about the weapons category because while losses is the biggest black hole, I think, in terms of assessing the actual damage that's been done to facilities, the weapons category is what you talk about in the piece as being probably the biggest place of discrepancy, and this is because the Pentagon does fake accounting, essentially, or they do an accounting, a method of accounting that paints the absolute best case, minimizes the cost to them for replacing munitions. Talk about how the Pentagon counts or accounts for its burn rate versus the reality of what it will cost to replace the munitions that it's using.
All right, so for interceptors, for example, interceptors, for those who don't know, just missiles that shoot down other missiles. The Pentagon keeps track of this by merging operational logistics with financial logistics. So, what's being fired and what quantities and what types, and multiplied by each one's unit cost. My beef is with how the Pentagon keeps track or tallies unit cost in its ledger. So, for example, the Pentagon has been firing lots of these interceptors called SM-2s. SM stands for Standard Missile. Two is just the variant. So it's fired tons of these SM-2 missiles that have been around for quite some time, and has been in service since, I think, 1970s, if not 1980s. They've been in service long enough to shoot down an Iranian passenger plane in the 1980s. So uh, they've been firing a ton of these, hundreds of them, these SM-2s, and how unit cost for this munition is calculated is through this thing called moving average cost, where it takes the stockpile's value and then divides the number of munitions in it. Now, the value of the stockpile is determined based on each new purchase of the munition. So the last time the SM-2 was purchased, it was for $1.2 million. Now, this accounting, so each time, so each purchase that feeds into the stockpile um, changes the moving average cost, the unit cost. So each one is fired, the Pentagon tracks how many, and then multiplies it by that moving average unit cost. So this poses problems in two main ways. One is that it doesn't account for price increases for replacing munitions. So everything's getting more expensive, even though, for the Pentagon, it's basically a socialized economy and the government has full control. They allow these prices to spiral out of control, particularly for interceptors. Even when they buy more, there's no economies of scale in place or apparent. And it especially poses problems when the munition that they're keeping track of that they're firing isn't purchased anymore. So the SM-2, the last time it was purchased was 2010, I believe. Now it's being replaced by the SM-6, which is a more advanced and far more expensive variant. So each time an SM-2 is fired, the Pentagon ledger shows the cost of the SM-2 something close to what it was last procured, which is 2010 and 1.2 million, rather than the amount that is budgeted for the SM-6 next year, which is the unit cost of over $6 million. So you can kind of see how this spirals out of control very quickly. So even if the Pentagon is right in terms of the quantities it's firing, how its accounting method to assess the cost of the war leads to a vast undercount. It is far, far lower than the cost that U.S. taxpayers will be asked to pay.
Right. Even if the military were still using the SM-2, it's not 2010. I mean, like 16 years later, it would cost quite a bit more than it cost in 2010, but you're still using the unit cost from that long ago without accounting for inflation. But then factoring in like that, so that right, even there, even in the case where it's a munition that they haven't replaced, they're still undercounting. But then you look at what happens when they replace it with a different system, which is of course going to cost more because they always do, because the contractors want more money. So all of these more advanced systems wind up costing more money per unit. Like it just balloons. I think the example you gave was, if they fire 50 SM-2s, it goes in the books as $60 million, a $60 million entry in the accounting. But replacing them with the SM-6 it costs $315 million. I mean, it's a fivefold increase, and stretch that out over the number of munitions that are being used here and how many times this is repeating. It could be a massive gulf between what they're reporting and what the actual cost is.
Exactly. And, you know, the Pentagon math is, I'm not going to say deliberately misleading, or actually, I probably will, but
Well, we could say, I'll say it. It's
yeah,
deliberately misleading. Yeah.
right. I mean, it's just a product. It's like a technocratic product that's just so immersed in the internal logics of Pentagon bookkeeping that it's irrelevant to anyone else. It's far too insular. And when it's leaked to the public, and that fact of how the Pentagon accounts for its costs, as in it counts it in a way that is not the amount that US taxpayers will be asked to pay, that context is omitted, which is really the genesis of why I decided to do this estimate, because um, I was just worried that that figure, that corrected figure of 50 billion, would become, the holy grail. And that's what um, every time there's been a leak from the Pentagon regarding the war's cost, there's been a bunch of think tanks like CSIS that have just scrambled to build their estimate around that figure. And as a result, like, the entire conversation about this war's cost has been too low. Even looking at narrowly at direct war costs like I did, the entire conversation has been low.
And I know, so leaving that aside, I guess, I mean, there's a whole host of things in the current state of the conflict, such as it is, where they're not firing, not, I mean, here and there they are, but they're not, intensely attacking Iran. They're not, the Iranians aren't intensely responding. So the munitions doesn't factor in. But can you give people a sense of how much it's going to cost, or how much it is costing, to just maintain the blockade? I know they're rotating one of the carrier groups back, but they've got two carrier groups still in the region. They've got assets, moved into the region, amphibious assault groups and other things. Like they've massed a lot of force in the region that's just sitting there now, parked, and some of it is, involved in the blockade. Some of it is just waiting to see if the war starts up again. But what does that look like in terms of just ongoing rolling costs here, as we have no indication that this is going to end anytime soon? Donald Trump was unhappy with the latest Iranian response to his peace deal, so negotiations are who knows where at this point. Certainly, I don't think he's going to revisit it until after he goes to China. And that pushes things another week, and then you're into end of May into June. Like, how much could we see this continue to go up, these costs continue to go up, even if the shooting war per se doesn't resume?
The cost to operate one aircraft carrier for a year, and this is the carrier group, so it includes the troops working on it, um, the uh, the carrier air wing as well is another cost that is added on top of this, but it's 1.8 billion per year to operate one aircraft carrier. Now, that unit cost during war, because of the contingency, because it's harder to deliver all of the stuff it takes uh, to sustain a carrier group, and also combat pay and factoring all in those extra costs, the cost balloons from 1.8 to around 2.5 billion. So now the I adjusted the cost on the basis of a 33% war cost multiplier,
Okay.
which is the per troop operating cost increase that happened during the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, so 2003 to 2014. I based that multiplier based on how much more expensive operations got during that time on a per troop level. Now, doing the blockade is lower cost, but it's still more expensive because it's still a deployment. It's still time that's not spent um, undergoing maintenance. You still have to skip it. You still have to pay
Right.
combat pay. So, for example, like over the last 21 days of this, so 39 days of combat and then 21 days of this fragile ceasefire, um, it still costs, just in terms of operations, 2.8 billion. So we're still talking less money per day than it is to have sorties constantly flowing off aircraft carriers and doing that. But you're still mobilizing, you still have mobilized troops, you still have mobilized reservists, you still have uh, military operations going on, and far more steaming hours, far more intensity to uphold a blockade and interdict ships. So it's not nothing. It's less than full on combat, but the
Right.
cost to just have those troops and have those assets deployed is non-trivial, and it's more expensive than peacetime. And it's not costs that would have been spent already, because the Pentagon doesn't view costs that way. They view if a ship is just sitting in the middle of the South China Sea, it and is pulled towards the Middle East, the Pentagon views it as a lost capability in the South China Sea, even if it's just sitting there. And it also factors in the cost of it deploying to the Middle East. So
Right.
these are just costs that build up over time, and you have to keep
Just
in
like
mind that
rolling. Right.
right, and this is the largest military buildup in the Middle East in the generation, as the Pentagon is so apt to point out, but not talk about the cost of
The
having all
cost
those
of it.
troops
Right.
deployed. Yeah,
So I don't want to, maybe as a final question, I don't want to talk about like the big picture economic impact because I don't think anybody really can do that yet. Part of it depends on how long uh, the strait stays closed, how long it takes before something approaching normal traffic comes through. But we're already seeing countries, having to cut back on major agricultural countries having to cut back on planting, sowing for the season because of lack of fertilizer. There's gasoline costs, obviously fuel costs are skyrocketing. The longer this goes on, the worse that's going to get. So there's a lot of things still unknown, but the overall impact can be profound here. And I also don't want to get into like the ancillary cost to the government, but I do think it might be worth maybe pointing out a few things that don't come in to what the Pentagon is doing here or what you're doing in analyzing the direct costs of the war, but are more indirect. You mentioned the VA earlier. They're now talking about suspending the gasoline tax, which is a loss of revenue for the federal government. Like, what are some of the things that people should just be aware of? Like, we don't have to get into what the numbers could look like, but just some categories of spending or revenue that are going to be affected by this.
veterans costs is a big one as far as budgetary costs are concerned, because it's not just the immediate danger pay which goes in the personnel costs. If a troop is injured and is permanently disabled, that's not just a cost for this year or next year; it's a cost for the rest of their lives. And there's these disability payments have been ramping up over time. They're more expensive per troop every year. So these are just costs that for every one troop injured during this war or killed, that's a cost that is going to be repeated for decades. That's going to be felt for decades. And as far as the economic impact, it's really a matter of how many times, um, I'm talking from an American perspective here because that's where I live, but how many times Americans will be asked to pay for this. So it's not just the budgetary cost that we just discussed, but it's the cost that they'll pay at the pump. It's the cost of food, because the core products like fuel and fertilizer costs have increased. Um, and that ripples into other sectors as well. I don't think the inflation numbers from today or earlier or whenever this week truly reflect the effect that this war's cost will have. I think, and what I'm saying is, I think it'll get worse over time. I think these costs to global shipping and into fuel costs, especially, will ripple out into other sectors, and you'll see just wholesale increases, huge ones across all sectors. The war in Ukraine, the world could, I think, just manage to get by coming off a recession. I think now, with the cost of living crisis still in effect, um, along with I think this next bout of inflation that's going to come from this war, plus another cut to social programs, because again, the Trump administration, or not again, I'm just mentioning it for the first time here, but the Trump administration wants another reconciliation bill akin to um, the big beautiful bill. This one, with 350 billion in military spending. The first one had 150 billion, and by rule, through the Byrd rule for reconciliation legislation, which says it can't add to the deficit past 10 years, it has to that extra military spending has to be offset by a cut or an increase in revenue. And it's not going to be an increase in revenue because the administration's tariff regime has fallen apart legally. Um, and it's they're not going to raise taxes, of course. So it's going to be a cut to social programs. So it's really a matter of not just how much the public is being asked to pay, which is astronomical, but how many times and in how many different ways they're going to be asked to pay for it.
Stephen, I think that's a good place to leave this conversation. But do appreciate you coming on the program, and want to do a deeper dive into the shenanigans that go on with the Pentagon budget one of these days. But the piece, again, it's a popular information. We'll have a link to it in the show description. The real cost of the Iran war is $72 billion for the first 60 days. Stephen, again, thank you so much for coming on the program.
My pleasure.